the ways that indigenous peoples are suffering because of climate change are very varied depending on the ecosystems where they find themselves in. But generally, the landslides in people who live in the high mountains, this is a major issue. Even with Arctic indigenous peoples, when there is the melting of the permafrost, and then their territories just slip into the sea. So those are the kinds of impacts that they feel. Of course, the impacts of droughts, as well as the impacts of it's either too much water in their communities or no water. And those who are living in the Arctic are really having a very difficult time adjusting because of the changes that are happening in their own communities. Well, indigenous communities are highly vulnerable to climate change because they live in very fragile ecosystems, whether these are mountains, high mountains, or deserts, or the Arctic, And so the impact of climate change is really magnified many times over in those kinds of ecosystems. So they need to do a lot of adaptation, when for instance, their islands are sinking and all that. And this also means serious serious ways of addressing the rights that they are fighting for. They are fighting for the right to self-determination, for sovereignty. How can you be sovereign when your territory upon which sovereignty is based is disappearing? So those are the kinds of impacts. But the other thing is, many indigenous peoples live in isolated, very remote communities. So actions whenever disaster strikes are also very slow. And talking about communications, there really has to be a lot of innovation done for them to be able to at least reach out to the general public and to the decision makers. So that's the vulnerability that they have, added to the fact that indigenous peoples are, even if they are like 5% of the total world's population, they compose 15% of the world's people, the people who are in poverty. So the level of poverty is also very high. So how do you, deal with in a situation? How would you address a situation when you don't even have the means to be able to adapt or to adjust to the changes brought about by climate change? The encyclical is really a very it resonates very well with the worldviews, the lives, and the cultural values that indigenous peoples are promoting and living by. So the ethics of caring for the earth, of the ethics of thinking about the future generations, and as well as the care, the kind of stewardship, custodianship that indigenous peoples have been practicing since time immemorial. It's sort of affirmed in the encyclical, see? So I think that for indigenous peoples, it can be a useful tool to strengthen further their assertion of their claims, and also their use of their traditional knowledge systems, which are traditional but are still contemporary. They are actually knowledge systems that are very modern, that can address the problems that we face because of climate change. And the other thing that I think is important in the encyclical is the recognition of the importance of human rights. Indigenous peoples are saying that we can even contribute further to solving the problems of climate change if our rights are being respected. Our rights to continue managing our forests in a sustainable way. Our right to continue planting the crops that we think are appropriate for our ecosystems. Our right to continue practicing our livelihoods, which are not very unsustainable compared to the modern livelihoods that we see now. So I think for indigenous peoples, there is a lot that can be culled from the encyclical that affirms their belief systems as well as their ways of living, and also their critiques of modernity and the imposition of all these so-called technological fixes, to solve the problem, when in fact the solutions are even more political and social.